It only takes me 2 years to catch on to things.
Which what? Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Al Williams.
This is episode 283. We'll be talking about blinding lasers, LEDs, and ETs. In Hackaday news, tickets for SuperCon 2024 went on sale on Tuesday. The True Believer early bird discounted tickets have all sold out. I think that was within the first 2 hours, and we had 100 of them. Well, at least 100 people are going to SuperCon. Woohoo! But seriously, SuperCon is... What can I say? It's a nice medium size. It's a small con, but I think everybody there is awesome. So it's like 500 people is a lot of awesome people, but it's not a lot of people. So I kind of love that aspect of it. Anyway, a fifth of the tickets are gone already. If you are interested in coming, head on over, links in the show notes. Get yourself some tickets.
Yeah, it'll be great to see everybody. I'm anxious to see what Tom is brewing up, since he always brings something interesting, and see how the badge comes out.
Yeah, I teasered it this year a little bit. It's going to be kind of SAO themed, and we're going to try to be using the extra connectivity on the SAOs a little bit. And we even have an SAO contest that you can brew up some cool SAOs before the show, bring them with, and show them off when you get there. And I think that's going to be really fun. Almost every SuperCon, for the last 6 years in SuperCon anyway, we've had this really nice SAO wall where people have put up cool SAOs that they've been working on. And in the meantime, we've amassed quite a museum. And of course, that will be up again. But this year, we want to totally double down. We want to encourage you, if you've never made any PCB project, or at least an SAO or a PCB art project, this is your chance. It's a super easy, low bar to get in on some pretty cool technology. Like, if you've never made a PCB before, this is PCB making 101. I can't think of a better beginner project in terms of wow per effort.
Hey, can we have an honorable mention for best homemade PCB SAO?
Oh, hell yeah. Yes, we can.
I think that would be a good category, because especially, those are small enough you could easily do these on a router or using some of the laser techniques, or I've seen even some 3D printer techniques to do. So they're small enough and low density enough, you could easily do these at home if you really wanted to.
You've thrown down the gauntlet. I am home etching a bunch of SAOs for people.
Okay,
and I'm
so I was just sitting here thinking the same thing. So we'll
limited edition etched by me by hand. That's a great idea, man.
Etched by Elliot, EBE. I think you got the slogan there. Right?
I mean, that's the point of SAOs, though. It really is. You can stick a little bit of yourself in there. Make it a nice bit of art. Just go nuts, be creative, and then bring enough that you can share and trade with some other people. I think it'll be really super cool. It's more of a crowd participation thing, and that's kind of why we want to get this out early and why we want to put a contest behind it, so it gets some publicity, so that everybody who's on the fence, should I do it, should I not do it, this pushes you over to make your first SAO and have a good time with it.
I'd mark mine etched by Al, but everybody would think it was etched by AI, and that would start a whole other conversation. So,
but that'd be cool too. The conversation would be about fonts, because there's a million good fonts to choose instead. Other things in the news, speaking of etched by AI, Taco Bell to bring voice AI ordering to hundreds of drive-thrus. Maya wrote this news piece up, and it's particularly ironic because McDonald's just bailed on their AI drive-thru. And I think, Al, you wrote up a piece about how many of the AI kind of service position replacement programs actually end up shipping a lot of their non-decodable results overseas. And I wonder if that's what's going to be the story here with Taco Bell.
Yeah, are you really talking to an AI, or are you talking to a guy in an apartment building in Bangalore? I don't know. I also wrote the piece a while back about, could you use AI for customer service? Not that you think it's so great for customer service, it's just customer service is so bad. How could AI be any worse? And my experience in the drive-thru, not necessarily at Taco Bell, so, Tricon or whoever owns Taco Bell, don't sue me. But we always say you go to the drive-thru and it's a joke. You order and then they give you a bag of whatever they feel like giving you. And You might as well just say I'd like some coffee grounds and some wet towels because you're going to get whatever they give you anyway. Years ago, I had a friend of mine who would not eat at a particular fast food restaurant because he had worked in one in college and said that they had been under orders, like if something had been messed up, put it through the drive-through because it was less likely that you would come back and, you probably would pretty far down the road realize it was
Oh,
wrong and not come back. So I don't know, can AI do worse than the unintelligible speaker voice that I get at the drive-through?
it remains to be seen. Let's find out.
The Peanuts teacher version of the drive-through, right? Womp 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 womp.
It must be that's how you sound on the inside too, right? So,
You would think, yes.
well, speaking of unintelligible, man, you're feeding me the best segues today. Let's head on off to What's That Sound?
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
So the name of the game here is we play a sound, you try to guess what it is. We pick randomly among the correct answers next week, and the lucky winner gets a Hackaday podcast t-shirt. Let's roll it.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's some kind of intro music. Dun, 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 dun. Oh. Well, given that it's Hackaday, I don't think it's anything like a 60s cop show intro, although that's certainly what it sounds like. Yeah. I don't know. I'm going to just say randomly it's the startup sound to an Amiga that was shipped in Brazil. I don't know. That's
Devilishly close. Not Brazil, Cuba. No, I'm kidding. But that's a great, that is actually a great guess. I will have our listeners head on over to hackaday.com/podcast, find the show notes, scroll on down to where it says, What's That Sound? Fill in the best guess with your handle and email address, and we'll pick among the correct winners next week. Well, let's head on off to the hacks. I wanted to start off with a precautionary tale. Phil Broughton's getting a laser eye injury and how to avoid it. I've heard a lot of laser eye injury stories, and I'm sure we'll talk some more stories later. But let me just say, this is the most gonzo story I've ever heard. Basically, Phil is a laser safety officer at, does he say where it is? He walks outside to find a salesperson and a client, and he's firing off a neodymium YAG laser of ridiculously high power and testing it out in the parking lot. Basically, the customer was like, we need to remove the paint strips from the highway without damaging the asphalt. Do you think you could do it with a laser? And he's like, yeah, sure, let's try. And so he grabs the highest power laser he's got and is trying to remove the stripes from the parking lot. First thing Phil says is, you do know that stripy material is retroreflective, right? And it's like, uh-oh. And they'd been doing it since like 8:30 that morning, trying to perfect it. And it's like, uh-oh. In addition, something went wrong, I think, with the steering mirror, and I'd blown the coating of one of the steering optics, Phil said. And instead of sending it at the ground, he was sending it at some vice president's Jeep Grand Cherokee, VP of sales, and he had not only burnt through the plastic wheel well, it had actually cut the brake line inside that person's car. And then worse, of course, and in terms of, the real laser safety officer then puts on his laser safety officer hat and says, well, it's hitting metallic things and reflecting in God knows which direction. And there's an airport over there and a military airport over there and a kindergarten over there. And Phil, the laser safety officer, got hit. It's extremely likely that the guy doing the demo got hit. Probably the customer got hit. Everybody had to go to the ophthalmologist, see how bad the damage was. This is just like, I don't know what to say about this story. Like, the number one rule in laser safety, and I think this is the take home, everybody out there, is always know how you're terminating the beam. As long as you get that right, like, everything else is secondary. If you walk into the beam, well, you shouldn't have done that. That was kind of dumb. If you put something reflective in the beam, well, don't do that either, clearly. But just controlled termination of the beam, and that was totally what was failing here.
Well, let me impersonate a lawyer here real quick, Elliot. He actually says he worked for Dollar Laser underscore company. He does that a couple of places. He's got like, dollar sign sales underscore manager or something rather than name the guilty
To protect the innocent.
or
Yeah.
one of the others. So dollar facilities underscore guy. There it is. So,
Yeah, right.
so I thought the number one rule of laser safety was not to look at the laser with your remaining eye. I thought that was the
Right? Yeah.
I actually wanted to write this one up. I had seen it and I wound up throwing it up for tips because I just didn't have the time. But it was quite a story, and I thought the really funny part was the two guys smugly wearing their laser glasses, and when he looks at them, he says, "Well, these are argon glasses, and too bad this isn't an argon laser." So they were, the false sense of security. So I thought that was the best part of that story was, oh, I've got my glasses and they don't do anything, right? So
Yeah, dude.
I've noticed though there are more hobby grade or at least pro hobby grade lasers now that come in the enclosures, right? So I think that's a
Yeah.
good thing. I don't think it's that much more money and your vision is priceless. So I will say one of my lasers is in the little backpack material, I don't know what do you call it, denier fabric or whatever, firebox. And so that's
Hmm.
good too. I still wear glasses though because there's no interlock. And so all you need to do is have one senior moment, unzip the thing, lift the lid up and go, oh wait, the beam's still on and, not
Right.
good. So belt and suspenders is not bad advice here.
I was in a hackerspace with some people who worked in the laser industry and did light shows and were super familiar with like all the laser safety rules. And one of the pieces of advice was just that was, put it in a box. And it's like, but I can't see it burninating, whatever it is I'm trying to explode. And the answer to that is get a webcam. Put the webcam in the box. Keep your eyes out. And it's like if it destroys the webcam, a new webcam's $10.
Right.
A trip to the ophthalmologist starts at like $100, and you still don't get your eyesight back.
Right. Yeah, I agree. When I went to school, the school I went to, one of the schools I went to, because I've been to way too many schools, they had a government contract to work on the magnetohydrodynamics MHD project, which was a big thing back in those days. And they had the super powerful lasers. And a friend of mine worked there. I got a tour. They had a line going across the wall. And when I asked what the line was for, they pointed me at a sign. So all the laser reflections off the optics were tuned to where they hit below that line.
Mm,
So you could not bend over below that line. You were supposed to keep your eyeballs above that line at all times. So if you dropped something, they had the little claws to pick them up off the floor because you weren't supposed to bend over. So theoretically, even the little reflections off the lenses for that powerful of a laser was enough to snap your eyes out. So
optical tables are always set up at waist height so that whatever's going on there, it does not hit you in the eye. And if you have to align beams, you do it from standing well above, right? So that you're only going to get reflections. But like you say, if the laser's bad enough, the reflections are bad enough. You should read the comments here. There are some absolutely fantastic horror stories about laser safety here. Like, it's the things you don't expect, like it hitting a round bolt head and just scattering randomly everywhere. Like, that cannot happen because you have absolutely no idea where the beam's going to go when it hits a round surface, right? Like, oh, one of my favorite is actually two people, Gyake and Helga, getting into a discussion about apparently with some ophthalmological experience about patients they've seen with bad damage due to staring into lasers. And one of them apparently was a teenager who had gotten into a laser staring contest and suffered pretty cooked damage and will have dots in his eyes for the rest of his life. The blink reflex, someone else in the comments actually mentioned the blink reflex, and that's what's interesting about the way they classify lasers is those cheap laser pointers, the under 5 milliwatt laser pointers, are class 1 because not because they're totally safe to point into your eye, but because your blink reflex will normally take over in time to prevent you from suffering damage, which is also why a 5 milliwatt IR laser is not, because you don't get the blink reflex if you can't see it, right? And so it's funny that that's kind of the basis for the first split in the classifications is how fast it'll cook your eye badly and before you can blink to get rid of it. And most of the lasers that we play around with these days are well above the 5 milliwatt cutoff. And that means basically instant damage if you get a direct hit in the eye and maybe damage if you get a specular hit in the eye. So wear your goggles, wear the right goggles. But, all the laser safety people I've talked to think that goggles are kind of belt and suspenders. They're kind of the last line of defense. What you really need to do is be smart up front and make sure you know where the beam's going and where the beam is stopping. And cheap and easy way to do that, like you mentioned, is just put it in a box.
Well, I thought the irony was that right after this incident, it started raining and destroyed the $250,000 laser, right? So I'm sure heads rolled.
Oh, dude, he says the guy got fired. No shocker there.
Yeah, not surprised. Well, the other thing I wanted to mention is reminded me a little bit because your eyes really are priceless, and as you get older, you start losing them. So you start realizing, wow, I gotta the amount of magnification I need to solder now is a lot more than it was 40 years ago. But our Lewin Day, actually got a blob of super glue in his eye and wrote that up.
Oh,
It turns out that's apparently not as bad as you would think, although I would not recommend it. The outcome was not nearly what, when I first read that story back in 2019, I was like, oh, this is going to be super bad. And it was survivable and, but probably not, kids don't try this at home, but apparently Lewin did. So I'll put that link in the show notes if somebody wants to think up more ways to abuse their eyes, and please don't do any of these things. So.
And before we leave, Brendan Robert passed on that Steve Wozniak had a laser safety officer badge with an eye patch. Picture of him with an eye patch. Laser safety officer. I love it.
Well, that's the old joke with the shop teacher where he lifts up his, index finger and his pinky finger and says, there's two things you got to remember when you're working with power tools, so. That would be better if we were on video. I have a much better
That's good.
setup for that, but yeah. Well, I'm going to the final frontier for my first pick this week. Katie Clow has faster than light travel by extraterrestrials. Detecting faster than light travel by extraterrestrials. I don't know. This is a scientific paper, and PBS had a beautifully done animated video about it. But it's kind of like saying how to detect time travel. By the way, we don't know how to do time travel, but, the idea is that if the current thinking on how a faster than light drive might possibly be possible if you could harness negative energy and, all these other things that we don't know how to do, then if it had a steady field, you wouldn't be able to detect it. But when that field collapses, all this energy and things would have to be brought into normal space, I guess. I'm not going to pretend I actually understand all this. And that would in fact be detectable. They said that like LIGO, the gravitational wave detector, would not be able to detect those, but it would be possible to build something that would detect these gravitational waves. And there was a few other things that they believe a collapsing, I hate to say warp bubble because that sounds real Star Trek-y, but the collapsing warp field would produce. I don't know. I mean, I find all that thing kind of interesting because, nobody wants to find alien life more than I do. But I'm also, what's the thing? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. And, I feel like if we were Christopher Columbus trying to figure out how we would figure radio towers, it's like, I don't think you really got a lot of basis for detecting radio towers, Chris. Sorry. One day, maybe we'll figure all this out. I'm seriously doubtful that everything they think about this today is correct. But it's still interesting. And, I'm a science fiction fan, so I like thinking about things like that, too, because it kind of informs your reading and writing of science fiction. So I enjoy that. I just thought it was an interesting thing. It's certainly, the graphics are beautiful. Maybe there's a movie in this somewhere. I don't know.
If you told me that something going faster than the speed of light and then decelerating, transitioning from light speed to faster than speed of light made some weird gravity waves, I would, without doing any math, say, yeah, probably. But then you'd be like, and what exactly would they be like? And the answer to that would be a lot of math. And that's where... that's where I stopped reading these papers, frankly. I think it's speculative, and then it's a lot of math based on something entirely speculative. Like, I don't know. And then the conclusion out of all of this is that it would be such a small perturbation that if you couldn't pick it up with LIGO, like the most sensitive instrument of any kind on the face of the earth in the history of ever, like I don't know, man. I don't know what
Yeah, it
it.
just seems odd. I mean, and I mean, there's precedent because the speed of light actually change, or the propagation of things that go at the speed of light change in different media, right? So you get the what is it, Cherenkov radiation. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I can see it
Sure.
spelled, which is where you get the blue glow in the nuclear reactors and stuff. So yeah, if you had something moving fast and suddenly it's not moving fast, you would think that energy goes somewhere,
Right.
but is it there? I don't know. And is it to that level of magnitude? I don't know. Think about it. Years ago, people said, "Oh, we think we've detected planets around other stars," and everybody went, "You're a moron. You're crazy. There's no, no, no." And now we know for sure that's really the case. And I always wonder if anybody goes back to those that were in the 70s and 80s and said, "Oh, wait, they were right. There was one. They did detect it," or if they could prove maybe now that that was not right, like they said at the time. So maybe this one day somebody will pull this Hackaday article out of the Antarctic archives or whatever and say, "Oh, they were right. That's exactly what happens." Or, "What a bunch of idiots. They didn't have any idea." So we'll see.
I love your take on it that it's food for science fiction plots, though, because like with all the warp drives out there in every sci-fi movie, a little bit of science on that would be fun. Wow, here's a slower than light project. This is programming tiny blinking light projects with light by Mitsela. This is an awesome little LED array toy that he made. It's powered by a coin cell. It's probably, I don't have the dimensions, but it's probably square inch, I would guess. And it's got a cheap microcontroller on the back to make them do displays. The question is then, how do you program this thing? And, all of the connectors you could add to the board would make it significantly bigger and significantly more expensive. So they were kind of all out. And he thought, well, maybe I can program in using the LEDs on the board as sensors. And so that's what he starts off on. What's really neat is the particular microcontroller that he uses, the CH003, has some analog op amps on some of the inputs. So you can do a little bit of gain staging and stuff to crank up smaller signals. Whatever. The point is, he is using it to make a comparator so that he can see what's going on with these LEDs. And I will say that I'm not 100% sure how his circuit's working, but I think he's using the LEDs basically in their LED is a solar cell mode. That is, the LEDs are generating a little bit of voltage and he's measuring that voltage directly, I think. But I'm not 100% sure either. What he notices, though, is that, if you look across LEDs or whatever, the thresholds are all wildly different and it's influenced by background light, what value you'd say is a 1, what you'd say is a 0 if you were trying to transmit into these things. But what works absolutely beautifully is using half of the display and the other half differentially against each other. So you use the light impinging on one LED versus the light on the other. And that he cooks up a little cell phone app that blinks one half of the screen white and one half of the screen black and transmits data that way. It's just a lovely project. I would really love to figure out what's going on with his circuit there. And I think he's not 100% sure. I'm even less sure. But my guess is it's just amplifying the super tiny signals off of the LEDs.
Well, this really reminded me of the stuff we've seen where people use light to get across an air gap, and I put a link for that in the show notes, right? So, sometimes there's nefarious things here where you say, "Aha, I see the blinking of the LED on that box that I'm looking at in a camera, and I can read all the data off of it even though it's not connected to anything." I was always amused that you can use LEDs that way. I mean, if you actually have ever decapsulated devices, all LEDs emit something, and just usually they're in a container, and it's probably not visible light, but, it's frequently infrared. So there's all these two-sided coins in electronics. So speakers can be microphones and vice versa. Motors can be generators and vice versa. Not always very good motors, generators, speakers, and microphones, right? You get, things are optimized for some use, but there's a lot of things like that where there's an inverse function. What's the difference between a thermocouple and a Peltier effect module? Very little, except, again, for how they're optimized for. The first time I saw that was in Popular Electronics. Somebody had, I want to say it was Forrest Mims, but I wouldn't want to be quoted on that, had the LED communicator where you would communicate over an LED beam and the receiver was using the same LED to receive. So you had, easy alignment. I thought that was really smart. I mean, it's a small device. You hold your phone up to it. The differential stuff solves a lot of problems. And I thought it was it was really a hack in the best possible use of that word. So
2-3 weeks ago, we just ran an article. You can use LEDs as sensors too. Lou and Day wrote this up. It's a great review of the kind of different ways of using LEDs as light sensors, both in this kind of direct generation of electricity mode, but then also in my favorite way to use LEDs as light sensors, which was discovered by the Mitsubishi Electric Research Laboratories. So I'm going to call it the Merle method, which is you reverse bias the LED and they have a little bit of parasitic capacitance in them. Both pins are hooked up to a microcontroller. You then put it in high Z mode, so it's kind of unconnected from everything. And the LED as solar cell kind of depletes this charge on the parasitic capacitor. And because the parasitic capacitor in LED is so small, you can use this time that it takes for it to charge that capacitor back up, and you just read the voltage off of one of the pins. Just use the time it takes for that to cross a digital logic threshold, say, to tell you how much light is falling on the LED. That's the Merle method. Lewin actually linked to their PDF paper in there if you want to do it yourself. The advantage of that is it's dead simple. It takes absolutely no parts. All you have to do is hook both pins of the LED to GPIO pins and then write a little bit of software. And that, I think, is also what's lovely in the end about Mitzella's design, is that he's already got these LEDs hooked up to these GPIO pins, and he's just figured out a clever way to take an existing design and use them as sensors. So, what's cooler than a 0-part solution?
yeah, and I was trying to think if I would have thought of this if I'd been faced with the same problem, and I think the answer is no. My experience with this has been infrared remotes, and they all operate at 38 kilohertz, and that's how you get rid of all the garbage, is normal things aren't flashing at 38 kilohertz. So so you can kind of pull the carrier out, but that would have been a lot more work. I think this was actually a much better solution, other than you can get all that on a module for $2, so, but to actually do it is harder work.
He's looking at making these things little giveaway boards, and I think he's got a BOM cost of under $1. So
Yeah,
your
yeah.
$2 IR sensors are just right out of they're just right
Well, I
out of the
agree.
ballpark in terms of how much they cost. But yeah, totally. It's worth noting that he gets like 5 baud out of these things. So it's not the fastest data transfer rate in the world. Your 38 kilohertz IR solution, I don't even know what the baud rates are on that, but it's fast.
Better than 5 baud, yeah. And
Yeah, by a factor of 1,000, probably.
but that's what I'm saying. I actually think for what he's doing, this solution is awesome, and I don't think I would have come up with that by myself. So I might now that I've seen it, right? That's the advantage of reading Hackaday.
That's why we're here.
Okay, my next hack is need a USB sniffer, use your Pico. Ateradov has a Pi Pico and used it to build a USB sniffer. And, it's one of those things, until you have one of those, you have no idea how useful it is to do. Wireshark actually supports USB sniffing, but you still have to have some way to physically get in there. And, the Pico's cheap. It's easy to use. I thought this was a great use for it. It's one of those things where you probably don't care about protecting your intellectual property in the Pico since it's open source, so you don't care about that. It's got everything you need. It's dirt cheap. Maybe not cheap enough for the last project, but certainly dirt cheap. It also made me kind of reminiscent. One of the first times I was actually in Hackaday, before I was with Hackaday, was because I had USB sniffed a signal generator and written Linux software to drive it instead of having to use their Windows software. So that was possibly the first time I had something featured in Hackaday, and so I always have a soft spot for the USB sniffers.
Yeah, USB is so much easier these days because, like you mentioned, you can feed it into Wireshark and then you don't have to think about any of the decoding side. The hard part, as far as there is a hard part, all of the hard part is the hardware. And if this thing makes the hardware part trivial, then that's a complete win.
Yeah, and if you notice, you could actually build this up just with a Pico and some solder, but if you're not willing to do that, they actually have a open source design for a board that has I guess it has a USB hub on it, so you can actually get a USB port plugged into it. And since it's open source, you can just go order them for wherever you want. Or, of course, like we were talking about earlier, you could make it yourself, but probably if you could do that, you're not afraid of soldering the Pi to start with. But I thought that was a great service, too, to have it packaged up like that and open source. So good job.
My last pick this week is a long rant from Carl Svensson, Pixel Art and the Myth of the CRT Effect. And this is really fun if you're into kind of retro graphics or whatever, or actually even if you're not, you have noticed that pixel art and kind of that blocky graphics aesthetic has taken over a lot of video games these days. And I think it's kind of a nostalgia wave. And then there was a video showing how probably a lot of this nostalgia, the things that people are nostalgia for in pixel art, are wrong. And his claim was that the old CRTs that you used to look at these video games on have kind of a shadow mask on them. And so only little points of light come through, not the full big blocks like we get with our nice high resolution monitors these days. And that kind of smoothed things out. That's the setting for this article, is to say, well, wait a minute, just how small are the holes in the aperture grill? And actually, Carl provides pretty conclusive evidence that you can resolve the individual pixels anyway. But there's all sorts of other funny artifacts with CRTs, like they have bloom, and just the fact that the light only peeks through about 60% of the screen's real estate means that everything's kind of dimmer and the colors are less contrasty. And what's funny then is if you take one of these video games that's designed for CRTs and you play it on a really nice high resolution monitor like the one I'm looking at, of course, these blocks look like the colors are oversaturated and they look like big blocks and all of that. And some of that is, I guess, the CRT effect. So this is kind of an interesting article because it's a response to a rant and then it's kind of qualifying and quantifying it from all sorts of different angles. If you're into retro graphics and what makes them look good, you should definitely give it a read. The end conclusion is that, retro game designers weren't trying to make their games look retro. The people who programmed Maniac Mansion, for instance, which was in 160 by 200 pixels, used every trick they knew to make it look not as horribly blocky as it absolutely was. And this is going to include things like anti-aliasing and dithering and, there were all sorts of these tricks that people used to use back in the day. Certainly the 8-bit, definitely the 16-bit era. They were trying to make it not look pixely and blocky. And so when we see them today on our high-res monitors and it looks pixely and blocky, it is maybe kind of a weird false nostalgia. And Carl's end conclusion is that CRTs weren't as bad as we think they were. You could totally see the pixels. Even running Windows 95 on a CRT, you could see the individual pixels. And that is, I believe, true. They were bled out. They were a little less contrasty, but you could totally resolve the individual pixels if you looked real hard. And second, the modern kind of fear of anti-aliasing, because it doesn't look blocky/retro enough, just comes out of nowhere, because everything they were struggling for in the late 90s was to make it not look blocky. And the fact that it does look blocky is, just a limitation of the technology. And he claims that a little more attention to picking color palettes nicely and using good anti-aliasing could make a more nuanced, nouveau retro pixel art.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you opened a pizza restaurant and said pizza just like your school cafeteria used to make, right? It's like,
yeah, right?
it's like maybe not your first thing you want to do. I'm old enough that I've owned millions of CRTs. Well, maybe not millions, but I've owned a lot of CRTs, and flat screens are a relatively new innovation from my time frame. So I forget that not everybody knows what's going on in the CRTs. So I put a couple of things in the show notes for everybody. 8-bit guy recently actually took apart a CRT, and I got to tell you, I was holding my breath because they're getting ready to crack it open, and I'm like, you realize that's this enormous vacuum in there, and it's probably just going to implode. And it turned out it had already lost its seal. I don't think he knew that, though. I think if you watch the video, I think they were ready for it to make some horrible thing, and I'm like, yeah, bad idea, and it turned out it worked out well. But he takes all the shadow masks and everything out. And so I don't know if before I saw that video, if I've ever actually seen an intact shadow mask from a CRT, simply because you didn't open them up, right? I mean, if you did, it was catastrophic. You didn't just gently open them up and take them apart. It is different that things have changed, but I do think some of it too is your brain is a great visual processor. Even though like Google Cardboard was terrible and you had your much less phone than you do now, 2 inches from your eyes showing you half screen of video in each eye, in 5 minutes you've forgotten how bad it is, right? You just totally filter it out. And I think the same thing could go here. Even when you had horrible, blocky 8-bit graphics, your brain just kind of figures that out and absorbs it. Turns out you probably don't focus on everything you're looking at all the time anyway, so your brain kind of fills in the blanks, and I think it's very good at filtering out all the crud. And I think that's another piece that we forget is the brain filter. If you are big on CRT effects, though, I also put a link in the show notes to a Linux foo where we talk about cool retro terminal. And I love doing like the old CPM emulations and stuff on that because it can be made to look like all these old terminals, even to the point that you can get the little rolling horizontal line and the twist at the curve of the screen. And I mean, it's amazing how many effects they have to simulate the old CRT terminals, which is not exactly the same thing as this, but it did remind me of that. And it also probably isn't as accurate as you remember it being, but it seems accurate and certainly is a great conversation.
Cool Retro Terminal is so awesome. I love that. Like, it's really fun because it does emulate all of the different defects of CRTs, and it's got sliders, so you can turn up the phosphor bleed and the persistence glow and stuff like this. It is really, really fun to play with, but also probably gives you a better feeling for what the defects are by kind of over exaggerating them, right? Like that kind of wobble in intensity across the screen that you would get from a not quite stable power supply, right? Like it lets you emulate that, and you can crank that up to 11 if you want to see what it really looks like when it's horrible, and then you can turn it down to a reasonable value. That's really, really, really fun to play with.
I've got the fake Altair 8800 sitting next to my desk, and I can fire up WordStar on a green screen, 80 by 25 display. So I had a Televideo 910 back in the day, and I wish I need to find like a Televideo 910 keyboard, fix that up, put a little LCD screen and run, a Raspberry Pi with cool retro term and make my fake Televideo 910 so I can relive my glory days. My final pick for the week is from Print Practical, overmolding wires with hot glue and 3D printed molds. Honestly, this is relatively unremarkable. He's basically doing injection molding with hot glue. But I think the reason I enjoyed it so much is frequently I see videos or things we cover, and there'll be some guy and he goes, well, first I took the bizarre polymer material and I put it in a press for 4,000 pounds, and you go, I don't have any of that stuff, and I'm not likely to get any of that stuff, right? But I got a 3D printer, and I got hot glue. So I was like, this seems like something I might be able to do. And don't get me wrong, it's interesting when you see the guy, machining the electron microscope adapter or something. That's great. I love those too, but I'm not doing that. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Also, I think one of the things Hackaday is great at is people are so forthcoming with where things don't work well for them, and I think that's a great service to the community, right? It's one thing to say, look at me, I did this great thing, I figured it all out, but we all know you had 5 times that you didn't figure it out, and this is a good example of where the first time he does it with hot glue and PETG, and mysteriously hot glue likes to stick to PETG. I mean, who would have guessed that, right? So you had to have a little release agent, and I mean, when you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, that's pretty obvious, but I probably have done the same thing. So that saves me, right? If I go to do this, which I might, I don't have to think about that because now I've seen that it's the case. So I really think that's a great thing. This is something that would be easily replicatable by anybody that's got even a basic 3D printer. It's very practical and useful. And like I say, we got to see how it worked and how it didn't work, which I really like that.
Half of the time I use hot glue, I'm using it for strain relief or to tack wires down to something. I mean, I use it for cable routing. I use it for strain relief. You know, you solder a wire onto a little dev board, right? You know that if that flexes 4 times, it's going to fatigue and come loose. So you grab a bit of hot glue and you hit a dab on it and boom, instant strain relief. It's perfect. This is that, but doing it actually right. Like he actually makes a mold for it and you squirt the hot glue in so that it's the right shape and that it looks good. I think my one trick is nonstick silicone baking paper. Hot glue doesn't stick to that at all either. And I've totally used that as an ad hoc mold a couple times myself. Like I'll make a little shape out of baking paper, or while it's still hot, I will press on it with my hands and try to mold it into shape in baking paper. And that
Nice.
is my totally ghetto version of this trick here. But this is doing it right. Little vegetable oil, 3D printed mold, boom.
Well, it seemed to me like this might be a good replacement for Suguru. And so I have a bitter history with Suguru because I always see it and think, oh, I should get some of this while I can. And then I get it. And then when I need it, it's 2 years old and it's no
It's
good
already
anymore,
done.
right? So, which is not their fault. It's my fault. I should plan better. It's great stuff when it's not, a hard ball. But I think this might be my next thing to attempt that where I would say, oh, I should go find the Suguru and see if it's dried out yet. Maybe I'll do this instead.
Oh, you know what? Hot glue also makes a really great LED diffuser. And if you could do molds with it, you could put them into interesting shapes.
Maybe something for an SAO?
Ooh, I didn't say that. Well, that actually would be really cool. So my first quick hack, an ESP makes a bicycle odometer, is a super simple hack by Clovis Fritzen. Basically, it's a reed switch, a magnet, and a microcontroller, but that's all you need to make your own little bicycle computer. I just love the idea that you can do it yourself. Next up, Robin, tiny trackpad fits on ergonomic keyboard. This is just such a sweet little trackpad attached to his split ergonomic keyboard. I had to go look it up. It's a circular trackpad made by GlidePoint. It's the GlidePoint circular trackpad. Speaks I2C, and he makes a nice 3D print, combines it with his sweet ergonomic keyboard, and he never has to lift his hands far from the home row. Aaron Christoffel, get your glitch on with a Pico EMP and a 3D printer. This is your weekly reminder that a 3D printer that you're not using is an awesome 3D manipulator device. Here he's taking Colin O'Flynn of Chip Whisperer's cut down EMP device and moving it around a chip to see where he can glitch it just right. Doing this by hand is of course possible, but tedious. As long as you got a 3D printer, you can code it up and get it to do it for you. And last up, indeterminate design. RC car gets force feedback steering. I love that we have motors that are cheap enough now that we could just randomly use them as haptic feedback controllers. Here he puts it in the kind of steering wheel controller for an RC car. He puts a load cell on the car, 2 ESPs, ESP now in between. It bumps back when he accelerates or goes around tight curves. He says it helps a lot when he's drifting. It's a fantastic DIY solution to a problem that I'm surprised we haven't seen the industry tackle yet. That being the remote control car industry. Big RC car.
Yes, the big pharma and big RC car, yes. Okay, my quick hacks this week. Matthias Kranz. This is a scientific method brought to an extreme. I'm going to quote from the article that he wondered what the best number of picks was to play guitar and took the experiment to its illogical extreme. Starting with 0 picks and working up, he wound up with 1,000 picks. I'll let you read the article to see how you strum with 0 to 1,000 picks, but it was pretty interesting. Will Dana, homebrew relay computer, features motorized clock. I really liked this one. I have a soft spot for the relay computers. Actually, it's more of a relay calculator, but very entertaining and very neat looking build. It's interesting to see young people, because he's a young guy, still having an interest in this sort of thing. And is it practical? No. I particularly like the motorized clock. I mean, if you're going to do a mechanical computer, you might as well do the motorized clock as well. So good job, Will. And the last, I put Jim Reese there because he's the kind of curator of all this, but it's actually, who knows who actually wrote this. It's a online copy of the Apollo computer brochure from, I don't even know when it was from, but back when Apollo computers were a thing. And if you're not old enough to remember, that's not the computers they used on the Apollo mission. It was the original sort of workstation computer. And then Sun came up and kind of knocked all that down. So there's a 26-page product brochure for the Series 10,000, quote, personal supercomputer. And, those were sweet machines in their day. Of course, now, you wouldn't carry that in your phone. But those were big dollar items work-wise. I've certainly bought a couple of them in my day and used many of them. They were beautiful machines and super, super awesome for their day. And it's a nice walk down memory lane.
I actually was one of those people who thought it was an Apollo computer and not an Apollo computer. So you got me.
I had somebody at a job interview ask me that one day. Says, Apollo computers, is that the ones they used to go to the moon? And you're like, well, no. Yeah, so
Yeah.
not your best foot forward on the interview. So.
Well, that brings us to our can't miss articles. These are long form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. This week I picked Arya Voronova's Hack on Self, Sense of Time. This is the start of what's probably going to be a long series because it's part of a long-running project of Arya's to try to figure out small ways that tech can help us with, kind of everyday problems we have. The examples here were a timer to help you remember how long it takes you to get from point A to point B because she has trouble estimating, when she's going to be somewhere. Or a little wrist vibrating buzzer thing that just reminds you every once in a while to stay on task. And so if you're one of those people whose mind wanders, this could be, I think she set it up at a frequency that would drive me absolutely insane. I think it was once every minute. But you could even imagine doing this, if your attention span runs a little bit longer, you could imagine doing it once every 5 minutes. Take a page from like the Pomodoro method people and do it once every 20 minutes. And just every time this thing goes off, you say, am I doing the right thing? And it's just like a little signal to remind you to reconcentrate on your task. She's just playing around. I don't think any of these are the right solution yet for her, but she's just kind of playing around with ways that you can build small technological things that help you and make your life better. And maybe your problem isn't her problem, so you're going to have to make your own device. And I think her point is that the big cell phone companies and the smartwatch companies say they want to help you with these things. And, they give you sleep trackers and fitness trackers and things. But in the end, what they want to do is sell you expensive hardware and or get you hooked up to a service. And Arya is deeply skeptical of kind of their end motives and their ability to focus on the particular problems with whatever sense of time that she has. So what I love most about kind of this project is that it's a very personal tech project because the strong suit of DIY projects is that we can do exactly what we need for us and not what Apple decides they want to charge us for. And so I think that's what I really love about these. And they're all just experimentations at this point. But she's been working on this for, 8 or 10 years. This is kind of a long-term, big idea project. I'm not going to lie. She's kind of trying to turn herself into a cyborg to some extent, DIY Hackaday cyborg. While the idea is pretty lofty, a lot of the individual projects are actually dead simple. And like the timer she made to say, how long does it take to get from point A to point B, the timer logger was made on a dev board she made for no other actual purpose. It was the I made this and I don't know why dev board, literally by that name. And I think that's part of what appeal of these projects to me too, is that they are very small projects that solve very niche problems, or at least aim to solve very niche problems. And so they make awesome kind of quick hacks to boot. And I think sharing them with us is really cool. And I know she's got a ton more of these. So this is, this is the tip of a very large iceberg that's going to play out over the next few months. And I'm looking forward to seeing that too. I don't know what. It's a big lofty goal on one hand, but then they're simple and clever hacks on the other, and I just love the combination of those two. And I hope she can get this done and build up a community of people interested in doing this sort of thing. And judging from the comments, so many people said they thought that the vibrating once in a while wristband thing would be a really neat project.
You know the old saying, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is, right? So in theory, I'm all for making myself into a cyborg. I really would love to do that. In practice, I just like I was talking about, I rarely do a project and go, oh, that was perfect the first time. So I'm less willing to experiment on myself than some people. Granted, a wristband with a buzzer on it is pretty low stakes, but some of the cyborg proposals, I'm not really ready to have the RFID chip jammed into under my skin. But theoretically, man, I think it's great. I wish they could build me all sorts of new stuff, or that I could do it myself. And of course, I can't pass up the opportunity to quote Star Trek. Khan said, improve a mechanical device and you may double productivity, but improve man and you gain 1,000-fold. So hacking us is probably the most productive hacking you could do, but it's also the most risky hacking you can do. So when you shoot the laser in your eye, it's hard to back away from that, right? Just to bring us back full circle. The time management thing, we talked about that some on our anniversary show, if you recall, and we all had our own little challenges with that and our own little personal hacks for how to do that. Mine, very simple. I just discipline myself to go, oh, I'm really excited to go play with the new toy or work on this new project. But before I can do that, I have to meet these two goals, right? Or whatever. And I find that to be very effective because I always have so much enthusiasm for the new thing. And the trick is to discipline yourself to not start on it until you finish the old thing. And that will give you the energy to pass through the old thing, or at least it works for me. So I don't know, Elliot. I mean, how about you? What do you want to replace as a cyborg?
I think I should have said non-destructive cyborg because like your main objection here is, you don't want to medically insert some chip in yourself. And, these are wristbands. She's a clever experimental, low risk, non-invasive cyborg. But yeah, totally. I actually do think the take a moment to think about what you're doing now thing is useful. I am not one of those people who gets hyper focused on stuff, but I can concentrate on things for a long period of time. And, sometimes when you're hacking on a problem, you could be hitting your head on it for 45 minutes or an hour, and it would have been more productive for you to step back and say, take a 5-minute break, go downstairs, get a cup of water, come back up and think about it again. And I know I was doing some system and mini stuff last night that I'm not particularly good at. And it was late at night and I was just hammering at it until 1 a.m. If my wife wasn't sleeping, if she'd come up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hun, should you go to bed?" I probably would have said, "Yeah, I'm at a bit of an impasse. I should either put this down or take a 20-minute break and think about it a little bit." And as it was, of course, I woke up the next morning, problem was solved within half an hour. Check, right? like I promise this would have worked. And so if you can make some sort of, just a reminder to be more thoughtful about the kind of meta process. Am I working on this problem in exactly the right way at this moment? Without it being too distracting. Like I couldn't take it every minute. That would drive me absolutely up the wall. But every 10 minutes, every 20 minutes, I don't know what the right time is.
I'm the worst for that. If I get wrapped around a problem, I won't eat, sleep, or do anything else, which we won't mention, until it's done. And it's very difficult, especially for the people around me, right? Because it's like, and if you do manage to pry me away, I'm in this strange half state where I don't really exist in this universe. So I'm just kind of off in this weird space. So I get that. I don't know that a buzzer on my wrist or on my phone or anything else is actually going to help me. It might be not a true story, but it was told to me as a true story that there was someone at Bell Labs whose job it was to go around and tell the people to go home. It's 5 o'clock, doctor. Go home. And so I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that's a real common problem in our business. And it's funny. I think if you look at the general population, that's a real distinguishing factor, right? Because most people will go, oh, that didn't work. Well, I'll just go do something completely different, right? I'll give up. I'll pay somebody to do it. I will go, no, and I think we're all like that, right? We're not going to stop until we get it fixed. And certainly some of our late night badge hacking at the last minute has proven that we're all like that, right?
Oh yeah.
We don't just go, oh, well, I guess it's just screwed and we're not going to be able to do it. We just sit and beat on it. And if it's 4 in the morning when we get done, it's 4 in the morning when we get done. So I don't know. It's an interesting idea. What could you do about that? But I'm not sure I would want to curb that. I mean, there's a line there, right? I mean, I agree. Sometimes you've just done too much and you need to go have a break, do something for half an hour and come back to it. But I think sometimes that doggedness is not a bad thing. And I'm not sure how to tell the difference between when it's a good thing and when it's a bad thing.
Yeah, and whether your wearable could help you with that or not. If it's not forcing you to do it, if it's just saying, hey, I do kind of like that it's just a periodic reminder somehow.
Okay, my can't miss this week from Dan Maloney. Dan's got this great series called Radio Apocalypse, and this time he tackles HFGCS, the backup plan for doomsday. That, for the uninitiated, is the high-frequency global communications system. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's because I was a child of the Cold War and we ducked and covered in school and all that, but all this apocalypse stuff really appeals to me, and it's a morbid fascination, right? You should try to get as far away from all this as possible. So I don't wish this would happen, but I think I am largely interested in all these horrible disaster scenarios that come up, and Dan does such a good job of covering it. The idea is very, very simple, which is, well, if the bombs are falling and everything's, being destroyed, how do we have command and control? And how do we order the launch of the deterrent nuclear missiles? And one of the answers to that was high frequency radio, what hams would call HF. So that also appeals to the ham radio side of me. I have been to Offutt Air Force Base before, which is now US Stratcom, I think. And you can see these antennas. I mean, they're huge. So just the antennas are fascinating. They're gigantic log periodics. And if you're not a RF guy or a ham radio person, a log periodic is kind of like the Yagi that you're familiar with, like a TV antenna. In fact, a lot of TV antennas were log periodics, but they're coupled in such a way that they have huge bandwidth. So usually these military log periodics can cover like the entire HF band, whereas your ham radio antenna, it's going to cover 100 kilohertz of a particular ham radio band, or maybe a couple, depending on how it's designed. So just the idea that they spent all this time, the power rating on the antennas is 25 kilowatts. They're just enormous, the infrastructure that was built. What had precipitated this article, if I'm not mistaken, was we had seen and he's got pictures from this, someone had toured a Minuteman silo that's apparently still in pretty good shape. And honestly, I think when we all saw it, we were like, wow, I can't believe they left all this visible. So I guess it's all old tech now. Just the idea that as a designer, you have to say, well, what if this happened? How do we get the best outcome we can get? Because obviously it's not a good outcome, but you want to, minimize your bad outcome and maximize your good outcome. What are the things you do? And one of the things they turned to was basically super ham radio on steroids. There's a lot of other things, though, and I don't think Dan gets into it in this one, but I know he probably has in some of the other ones, and probably will get into in the future, but like the hardened telephone network system. And there's all these things where Conelrad, for example, which I think he has talked about, which was later replaced with the emergency broadcast system. And there's so many different things to think about, because think about this, all these radio towers are also emanating radio signals that mean bombers can find you, right? And so there's just a lot to think about. So as a designer, it's interesting to see what kind of things they picked, what they didn't pick, and it would be really interesting if you could somehow find a design document to kind of look through what their thinking was at that time. You can infer some of it, but I'm sure some of it's just lost to history.
Yeah, I mean, in some of the background here, this was kind of the, if they blow up the phone system, the signal has to get there. How's it going to do it? And Dan and I guess a number of us at Hackaday are kind of ham radio freaks. And surprisingly enough, the answer to the U.S. military was also put it over the radio waves. It'll get there if you broadcast loud enough.
And I wasn't aware Curtis LeMay had been a ham radio operator. I obviously knew who he was, right? He was very instrumental in the Air Force, but apparently he was a ham radio operator. I didn't realize that.
See?
Learn something new every day on Hackaday.
That brings us to the end of this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. To follow along with the links or leave a comment, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. And as always, if you see anything cool or do anything cool, send us a tip, tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
Keep those hacks coming.
hold on a sec. I have to sneeze. Nope, I beat it down. And I can't leave without mentioning who was it who said that? Yeah, that's not going to make the cut.
I was waiting to see where that was going. I couldn't figure it out.
Let's go. That's not going to make the cut. You had to be there. You had to be there.
Altaradov, which I see I've misspelled.
How am I going to say this? I don't care anymore. I give up.
And before we go, now we get to see if I can find my stop recording button. Oh, there it is.